They scoffed at his ship, but their mockery stopped as fusion bolts shrieked from the Relic's cannon and atomized the Saurian's grav sled into glowing slag. Thomas Robinson staggered out of the dingy bar on Zephyria Station, his meager savings just lost in a rigged poker game, his faded leather jacket torn at the shoulder, his prized ship, the Relic, in desperate need of repairs he couldn't afford. The ship, last of the mighty Tempest battlecruisers, hulked in its docking bay. Hull plates rusted, plasma cannon cracked, jump drive leaking radiation, a shadow of its former glory. But it was all Thomas had left in the galaxy, his home, his livelihood. A wealthy Saurian approached, sapphire scales glinting. It hissed contemptuous words, offered a pittance to buy the Relic as scrap. Enraged, Thomas smashed his fist into its snout, hissed back that he'd sooner fly into a black hole than sell. The Saurian snarled a warning as Thomas turned away. War was brewing with the ruthless Zog Empire. Border raids escalating, patrols vanishing without trace, Zog dreadnoughts massing at the frontier. The battered old scrap heap of a warship was all that stood between the Empire and defenseless human colonies. Outgunned, outmatched, but never outdone. What the Relic lacked in power, Thomas made up for in sheer grit and balls. They scoffed at his ship as a relic, until it was the only thing that could save them. Humanity's last desperate hope against an implacable alien foe. All Thomas had to do was make this bucket of bolts space-worthy for one last fight. Thomas limped up the Relic's boarding ramp, the rusted metal groaning under his boots. Inside the dimly lit cargo bay, a familiar grizzled face greeted him. Jack Harrison, his first mate for over a decade. "Tom, we got problems," Jack grunted. "Fuel's down to fumes, food stocks are moldy protein bars, we need a job bad." Thomas sighed. "Tell me something I don't know, Jack. Saurian cleaned me out at poker." "Figured. Look, I got a lead. Vorax has a gig for us." "Vorax, that slimy slug, he's bad news." "Beggars can't be choosers. Says he'll pay premium for a cargo run to Keldari Prime." Thomas's eyes widened. "Keldari, that's deep in Zog space. It's a suicide mission." "Yeah, well, unless you got a stack of credits hidden in your jacket, it's this or we start selling our organs," Jack said. Thomas paced, mind racing. Risk annihilation by the Zog or waste away in this rusting hulk? Some choice. Fine. Set up a meet with Vorax, but I don't like this. "You think I do? I'll ping his broker, have him come to Bay 6. Jack stomped off towards the comm station. Thomas popped open an access panel, examining the fused power coupling within. One more thing to fix. A soft hiss from the airlock made him turn. A lithe figure in a hooded black envirosuit strode up the ramp. He tensed, hand drifting to his blaster. The figure stopped and slowly raised gloved hands to its hood. The fabric slid back, revealing striking violet eyes set in blue, scaly skin. A female Saurian. "Captain Robinson," her voice was smoky with a faint, sibilant accent. "I am Lyra, your cargo." Thomas stared. "I was expecting a package, not a passenger." Lyra stepped closer. "I require discreet passage to Keldari Prime. You have a reputation for successful smuggling runs." "Lady, I have a reputation for being damn near broke. Why shouldn't I just collect Vorax's fee for your head?" Her eyes narrowed. "Because I am not what I seem. I serve the Sapphire Dawn, and my package could change the course of the coming war." Thomas crossed his arms. "You're a rebel spy?" "Yes, and my companion is a Zog defector. A scientist with knowledge of a secret weapon that threatens us all. We must reach the resistance on Keldari." "This just gets better and better," Thomas muttered. A risky run now with political baggage, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. Desperation, fear, and a steely determination that mirrored his own. "All right, I'll bite, but if this is a setup, I'll space you myself." Lyra smiled thinly. "Charming. We have a deal then, Captain." She extended a gloved hand. Thomas clasped it, feeling the firmness of her grip even through the fabric. What the hell was he getting himself into? But the promise of a fat payout, and maybe Just maybe, a chance to strike back at the Zog. It was too tempting to resist. He had a bad feeling this milk run was going to get real complicated, real fast. But hey, that's why they called him the best smuggler in the Outer Rim. If he was going to go out, it might as well be in a blaze of glory. One last ride for the Relic and the old warhorse in the captain's chair. The Relic shuddered as Thomas pushed the throttle to full, the ancient battlecruiser groaning in protest. Vorax's coordinates blinked on the nav display. Keldari Prime, heart of Zog space. This job was insanity. "Strap in back there," Thomas shouted over the rising whine of the engines. "It's going to be a bumpy ride." Lyra and her companion, a hooded figure Thomas assumed was the Zog defector, buckled into the crew seats in the cramped cockpit. Jack slid into the co-pilot's chair, hands flying over the controls. Jumping to hyperspace in 3, 2, 1. The stars stretched into glowing lines as the Relic leaped forward, the battered ship shaking like it would fly apart. Thomas gripped the yoke, fighting to keep her steady. Suddenly proximity alarms blared. A trio of angular Zog patrol ships dropped out of hyperspace directly ahead, plasma cannons glowing with deadly charge. Shit! They must have tagged Lyra on the station. Thomas wrenched the yoke hard to port. Evasive maneuvers. The Relic shuddered as the first volley of plasma skimmed her shields. Thomas jinked and weaved, pushing the ship to its limits. The inertial dampeners struggled to compensate, throwing them against their restraints. "Shields at 50%, Jack yelled. "We can't take another hit like that." Thomas gritted his teeth. Time to see what this old bucket could really do. He slapped the weapon controls, bringing the Relic's dual fusion cannons online. The targeting reticle flashed red, locking onto the lead Zog ship. "Eat this, you scaly bastards!" Thomas squeezed the trigger. Twin bolts of orange fire lanced out, slamming into the patrol ship's shields. They flared, absorbing the hits. "Damn it, we need more power." Thomas glared at the readouts. The Relic's reactor was redlining, unable to keep up with the demand. Lyra's voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, I have an idea. The Zog ships are linked by a quantum entanglement communication network. If we can disrupt it, their coordination will be thrown off." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" "My associate can send a feedback pulse through the network using the Relic's comm array, but it will take time to prepare." "Time we don't have," Jack growled as another plasma bolt rocked the ship. Thomas made a split-second decision. "Do it!" He wrenched the Relic into a corkscrew dive, trying to evade the Zog's fire. Lyra and the scientist hunched over the comm station, fingers flying over the controls. The Zog ships bore down on them, cannons hammering at the weakening shields. "Any time now would be good," Thomas shouted, sweat beading his brow as he wrestled with the controls. "Almost there!" Lyra punched a final key. A pulse of static washed over the comm channels. The Zog ships suddenly veered apart, their formation disrupted. "It worked," Thomas crowed. He targeted the lead ship, now isolated, and unleashed a full barrage from the fusion cannons. The bolts tore through the weakened shields and ripped into the hull. The Zog ship exploded in a ball of plasma. The remaining patrol ships whirled in confusion, their communications scrambled. Thomas seized the advantage, blasting the second ship to molten slag. But the final Zog vessel managed to get off a lucky shot. A plasma bolt punched through the Relic's rear shields and slammed into the engine housing. Alarms shrieked as the reactor temperature spiked into the red. "We're losing power." Jack frantically worked the controls, trying to reroute systems. "The main drive is offline." Thomas cursed under his breath. They were dead in space, easy prey for the remaining Zog ship. He scanned the nav charts desperately, looking for somewhere, anywhere to hide. There, a desolate moon, barely a blip on the scans. It would have to do. "Jack, give me everything you can to the maneuvering thrusters. We're setting her down on that moon." "Are you crazy? We'll never make it." "You got a better idea. Do it." Jack shook his head but obeyed. The Relic wallowed and shuddered as Thomas aimed her battered bulk towards the grey surface of the moon. The Zog ship, sensing weakness, bore down on them, cannons charging for a final volley. The moon's surface filled the view screen, rocky and pitted. Thomas gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. This was going to be rough. "Brace for impact," he roared. The relic hit the surface in an explosion of dust and debris, skidding and bouncing across the uneven terrain. The crew were flung against their restraints like rag dolls. Consoles sparked and exploded. Finally, mercifully, the ship ground to a halt, half buried in a crater of its own making. Thomas sagged back in his chair, his head ringing. They were alive, somehow. "Damage report," he croaked. Jack consulted the flickering readouts. "Main power is out. Life support on backup. Shields are gone, and the engines are slag." Thomas dragged a hand over his face. "In other words, we're not going anywhere. I might be able to jury-rig the engines given enough time, but we'll need replacement parts." Thomas unstrapped himself and stood on unsteady legs. "Then I guess we're going scavenging. Lyra, you and your friend stay put. Jack, with me." He grabbed a plasma rifle from the weapon locker and tossed one to Jack. Never knew what you might find on these abandoned moons. The two men cycled the airlock and stepped out onto the desolate grey surface. The stars glittered coldly above in the airless black. Thomas activated his helmet's spotlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. They picked their way through the craters and jagged rocks, searching for anything that might be useful. Ship parts, refined metals, hell, even just some ration packs would be a boon. Suddenly Jack stopped short, his light aimed at a hulking shadow ahead. "Tom, look." Thomas raised his own light and felt his jaw drop. There, half buried in the dusty surface, was the unmistakable shape of a Tempest-class battlecruiser, like the Relic, but intact. A faded name was stenciled on the pitted hull. Odyssey. "I don't believe it," Thomas breathed. "The Odyssey. She went missing decades ago on a deep-range scouting mission. The whole crew just vanished." "Looks like we know where they ended up." Jack strode forward, running a hand over the cruiser's flank. "Tom, if this ship has the parts we need, we might just pull this off after all." Thomas felt a fierce grin spread across his face. "Let's get to work." The two men boarded the Odyssey through a rusted gash in the hull, suits lights playing over the abandoned corridors. It was eerie, like stepping into a ghost ship. The crew had left everything in place, as if they'd simply stepped out for a moment. In the engine room, they found a treasure trove of spare parts and components, all perfectly preserved in the airless environment. They set to work, cannibalizing what they needed to get the Relic spaceworthy again. As Thomas worked to detach a power coupling, his light fell on a data terminal, its screen miraculously still glowing. Curious, he tapped a key. Schematics for the Tempest-class ships flashed onto the screen, along with a flashing warning that chilled his blood. "Sajaka, look at this. There's a flaw in the Tempest design. The shield matrix has a resonance frequency that can be exploited. That's why they were decommissioned. They were vulnerable." Jack frowned at the schematic. "Vulnerable to what?" "Some kind of Zog energy weapon. It could punch right through the shields like they weren't even there." A slow smile spread across Jack's weathered face. "Well now, ain't that interesting? You know what this means?" Thomas nodded slowly, the beginnings of a crazy, desperate plan taking shape. "Oh, I know exactly what it means, old friend. It means we have a fighting chance. We know their weakness now, and we're going to exploit the hell out of it." He looked around at the Odyssey's silent bulk, his mind racing. With the salvaged parts and this new intel, they could upgrade the Relic's defenses, turn the Zog's own weapon against them. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. Thomas clapped Jack on the shoulder, a fierce light in his eyes. "Let's get to work. We've got a ship to fix and a war to win." They gathered up the salvaged parts and schematics and made their way back to the Relic, a new sense of purpose driving their steps. The Zog thought they were beaten, that the Relic was just a rusting relic of a bygone age. But they were about to learn that this old warhorse still had some fight left in her, and her captain would make damn sure the Zog paid for underestimating him. He'd show them what a mistake that was. The Relic dropped out of hyperspace, the battered ship shaking like a leaf in a storm. Thomas gripped the controls, his eyes fixed on the view screen. Keldari Prime loomed before them, a mottled grey orb shrouded in the angry red glow of its dying sun. "We made it," Jack breathed. "I can't believe that bucket of bolts held together." Thomas allowed himself a tight smile. The Odyssey's salvaged parts had given the Relic a new lease on life. The upgraded shields hummed with power, ready to shrug off anything the Zog could throw at them. But his smile faded as the ship's sensors pinged a warning. A holodisplay flickered to life, showing a swarm of angular shapes surrounding the planet in a tight formation. "The blockade," Lyra said grimly. "The Zog aren't taking any chances. They know how valuable Dr. Zoran's information is." Thomas studied the display, his mind racing. A frontal assault was suicide. The Relic was tough, but she was no match for that many ships. They needed a way to slip past undetected. His eyes fell on the readout of the Zog ships, supply vessels heavily armed and armored. An idea began to form. "Lyra, that data we pulled from the Odyssey, did it include Zog ship codes and transponders?" The Saurian's violet eyes widened. "Yes, it did. You're not thinking—" "Oh, he's thinking all right," Jack said with a grin. "And I like the way he thinks." Thomas turned to the scientist who had been silent, hunched over a datapad. "Dr. Zoran, I need you to help Lyra modify our transponder signal, make the Relic look like one of those supply ships." The Zog nodded, his scaled features unreadable. "It can be done, Captain, but it will only fool them for so long." "I'll take any edge I can get. Jack, plot a course that matches the supply ship routes. We're going to hide in plain sight." The crew scrambled to their tasks, modifying the Relic systems and prepping for the deception. Thomas felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with dread. This was the biggest gamble of his career. If it worked, they'd be heroes. If not, well, he'd always wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. "Transponder signal is set," Lyra reported. "We read a Zog vessel Krishkathal on their scopes." "Course laid in," Jack said. "Ready to run the gauntlet on your word." Thomas nodded, his grip tightening on the controls. "Punch it!" The Relic surged forward, her new engines propelling them towards the blockade at a steady clip. Thomas kept a wary eye on the sensor display, watching for any sign they'd been made. But the Zog ships didn't so much as twitch as they approached. The transponder was working. They slipped past the outer picket, weaving between the massive battleships with their weapons powered down. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They were past the blockade. Now they just had to reach the surface and find the rebel base. And that's when all hell broke loose. Alarms blared as the sensor board lit up like a Christmas tree. "They're onto us," Jack shouted. "Zog dreadnought, bearing down fast." Thomas cursed under his breath. So much for their clever disguise. The Zog weren't fooled for long. The dreadnought filled the viewscreen, a monstrous wedge of metal and guns. It spat a volley of plasma, the bolts slamming into the Relic's shields. The ship shuddered under the impact, but the upgraded defenses held. For now. Thomas wrenched the ship into a diving roll, trying to put some distance between them and their pursuer. But the dreadnought matched them move for move, its guns hammering at their shields. "Oh, we can't outrun them," Lyra said, her voice tight with tension. "And we can't outgun them, what do we do?" Thomas stared out at the looming bulk of Keldari Prime, his mind racing. The planet was surrounded by a dense asteroid belt, a treacherous maze of rock and ice. Flying into that maelstrom was suicide, but it was the only card they had left to play. "Jack, plot a course into the asteroid field. We're going to lose them in the rocks." "Are you insane?" Jack gaped at him. "We'll be smashed to bits." "No, we won't." Thomas met his friend's eyes, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "Because I'm the best damn pilot in the Outer Rim, and the Relic is the most maneuverable ship in the galaxy. That dreadnought won't be able to follow us." Jack shook his head, but there was a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Aye, aye, Captain. Course laid in. Let's show these Zog bastards what we're made of." Thomas gunned the engines. sending the Relic hurtling into the asteroid field at full throttle. The ship bucked and jolted as Thomas wove between the tumbling rocks, his hands flying over the controls with preternatural skill. The dreadnought tried to follow, its bulk ill-suited for the cramped confines of the field. It smashed through smaller asteroids, its shields flaring with each impact. Then Thomas saw it, a cluster of asteroids spinning in a tight formation dead ahead. There was a gap at the center, barely wide enough for the Relic to pass through. The dreadnought would never make it. It would be caught in the tumbling rocks and torn to shreds. Thomas aimed the Relic straight at the deadly gauntlet, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The ship shook and groaned as they approached, the asteroids looming like giants. At the last second, Thomas fired the maneuvering thrusters and rolled the ship on its axis. The Relic slipped through the gap with inches to spare, metal screeching as it scraped the sides. Behind them, the dreadnought ploughed into the asteroids with a titanic crash. Explosions rippled along its hull as it was battered and crushed by the merciless rocks. Thomas let out a whoop of triumph as they shot out the other side. The dreadnought a crumpled ruin behind them. "That's how it's done, people. The Relic strikes again." Lyra sagged back in her seat, her scales shining with sweat. "That was incredible. I've never seen flying like that." Jack clapped Thomas on the shoulder, his face split in a fierce grin. "That's why he's the captain. There's nobody better in the hot seat." Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd beaten the odds, outrun the Zog, and made it to Keldari in one piece. But the hardest part was still ahead. They had to find the rebel base and deliver Dr. Zoran safely, and on a planet crawling with Zog troops, that was easier said than done. Still, as Thomas looked around at his crew, battered but unbowed, he felt a surge of pride. They might be a ragtag bunch, but they were the best damn team in the galaxy. And together, they just might pull off the impossible. The Relic settled onto the rocky surface of Keldari Prime, kicking up a cloud of dust as the landing gear touched down. Thomas powered down the engines and turned to his crew. "All right, folks, this is it. Dr. Zoran, you're with us. Lyra, you take point. Jack, watch our backs." They disembarked, weapons at the ready, scanning the barren landscape for any signs of Zog patrols. The air was thin and bitter, the sun a dim red orb in the hazy sky. Lyra consulted a handheld scanner, pointing towards a series of low hills in the distance. "The rebel base is that way, about 20 clicks. We'd better move fast and stay low." As they trekked across the rugged terrain, a flicker of movement caught Thomas's eye. He raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. There, huddled in the shadow of a boulder, was a group of saurians. They were a ragged bunch, their scales dull and their eyes haunted. Thomas approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Easy there, friends. We're not Zog. We're here to help." One of the saurians, an elderly male with a scarred snout, stepped forward warily. "Help? There is no help for us. The Zog have taken everything. Our homes, our families. We have nothing left." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy. He knew all too well what it was like to lose everything to the Zog. "We're heading to a rebel base not far from here. You'll be safe there. We can take you with us." The Saurian refugees exchanged glances, a flicker of hope in their eyes. "You would do this for us? Why?" Thomas shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because sticking it to the Zog is what I live for. Now come on, we need to keep moving." The group set off again, the refugees falling in behind them. Lyra gave Thomas a sidelong glance, a hint of admiration in her violet eyes. "That was a good thing you did back there, Captain. Not many would have stopped to help." Thomas just grunted. "Yeah, well, I'm not most people." They reached the base without incident, the refugees safely delivered into the hands of the rebel medics. In the command center, Dr. Zoran was ushered before a group of grim-faced rebel leaders. The Zog scientist cleared his throat, his scaled hands trembling slightly. "I must thank you for the rescue, Captain Thomas, and for giving me the chance to share what I know. He tapped a few commands into a console, bringing up a holographic display of a monstrous spherical device. This is the Zog's secret weapon. They call it the Doomsday Device. It is capable of destroying an entire planet. A murmur of shock and fear rippled through the room. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes hard. How is that possible? Dr. Zoran zoomed in on the schematic, highlighting a pulsing red core at the heart of the device. The weapon is powered by a rare element called Zorfium. It is highly unstable, but immensely powerful. The Zog have been scouring the galaxy for it, and they have found a rich deposit here on Keldery Prime. The rebel leader, a grizzled human with a cybernetic eye, slammed his fist on the table. So that's why they've occupied our world, not just for the strategic value, but for the Zorfium. Dr. Zoran nodded gravely. With the Doomsday Device operational, the Zog will be unstoppable. They will hold the power to destroy any world that defies them. A heavy silence fell over the room. Thomas could see the despair in their eyes, the weight of an impossible task bearing down on them. But he had never been one to back down from a fight. He stood, drawing all eyes to him. Then we stop them. We steal the Zorfium and we destroy the Doomsday Device before they can finish it. It's the only way. The rebel leader raised an eyebrow. A bold plan, Captain. But how do you propose we infiltrate the most heavily guarded Zog facility on the planet? Thomas just grinned, a feral light in his eyes. Leave that to me and my crew. We've got a few tricks up our sleeve, and we've got a score to settle with the Zog. He turned to Jack and Lyra, who were watching him with a mix of trepidation and anticipation. You two up for another impossible mission? Jack just cracked his knuckles, a wry smile on his weathered face. I thought you'd never ask, boss. Lyra hefted her blaster, her scales shimmering with a predatory gleam. Let's make them pay for what they've done to our people. Thomas nodded, feeling the old thrill of adventure coursing through his veins. The odds were stacked against them, the danger greater than ever. But that had never stopped him before. The Zog had taken everything from him, his home, his family, his future. Now it was time to take something back, and if he had to tear the galaxy apart to do it, then so be it. He turned to the rebel leaders, a fierce determination burning in his eyes. All right then, let's get to work. We've got a war to win. Thomas stood before the rebel leaders, his crew at his side. We'll do it, he said, his voice unwavering. The Relic is the only ship that can pull this off. We'll get that Zorfium and put an end to the Doomsday Device. Jack nodded, his weathered face set in determination. Damn right we will. The Zog won't know what hit 'em. Lyra's scales shimmered with anticipation. I've got a few new toys I've been dying to try out. Those Zog bastards won't stand a chance. The rebel leader regarded them with a mix of hope and skepticism. It's a suicide mission. The facility is heavily guarded, and the Zog will stop at nothing to protect their precious Zorfium. Thomas just grinned, a feral light in his eyes. Then it's a good thing we've got an ace up our sleeve. Grix, get in here. The doors slid open, revealing a hunched figure in a tattered Zog uniform. Grix, the defected engineer, shuffled forward, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Grix here used to work at the mining facility, Thomas explained. He knows the layout, the security systems, everything we need to get in and out undetected. Grix nodded, his voice a raspy whisper. I can get you inside, but we must hurry. The Zog, they suspect. They will be watching. Thomas clapped the engineer on the shoulder. Then we'd better get moving. Jack, prep the Relic. Lyra, make sure those new weapons are online. We leave in an hour. As the crew scrambled to make ready, Thomas pulled Grix aside. I need you to tell me everything, every detail about that facility. We can't afford any surprises. Grix licked his scaly lips, his eyes haunted. The Zorfium, it is kept in a secure vault at the heart of the facility, guarded by elite troops and automated defenses. The only way in is through the main gate, but it is heavily monitored. Thomas nodded, his mind racing. Then we'll need a distraction, something to draw their attention while we slip inside. Grix hesitated, then pulled a small device from his pocket. I have been working on something, a virus to infect their systems. It will disable alarms, create false readings, chaos. Thomas took the device, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Grix, you beautiful bastard, this is exactly what we need." An hour later, the Relic shot out of the rebel base, engines roaring as it tore through the sky towards the mining facility. Thomas sat at the controls, his eyes hard as he watched the scanners for any sign of trouble. He didn't have to wait long. As they neared the facility, a squadron of Zog fighters rose up to meet them, their weapons blazing. Thomas just smiled, his hands flying over the controls. "Let's see what these new upgrades can do, Jack. Bring the plasma cannons online." The Relic shuddered as the cannons fired, lances of blue-white energy slicing through the Zog fighters like a hot knife through butter. Thomas wove the ship through the debris field, using the asteroids for cover, as he picked off the remaining fighters one by one. In a matter of minutes, the skies were clear, the smoking wreckage of the Zog squadron drifting in the void. Thomas let out a whoop of triumph, adrenaline surging through his veins. "That's what I'm talking about. The Relic is back, baby." As they approached the facility, Thomas brought the ship in low, skimming the surface to avoid detection. Grix hunched over the console, his claws flying over the keys as he uploaded the virus. "It is done," he rasped. "The systems will be disrupted for a short time. We must move quickly." Thomas nodded, bringing the Relic in for a landing near a service entrance. He, Jack, and Lyra donned their gear, checking their weapons one last time. "All right, folks, this is it. Grix, you stay here and keep an eye on the systems. If anything goes wrong, you get the hell out of here, understand?" Grix nodded, his eyes wide with fear and determination. "I will not fail you, Captain." Thomas, Jack, and Lyra slipped out of the ship, moving swiftly and silently towards the entrance. The door was locked, but Lyra made short work of it with her hacking tools. Inside, the facility was a maze of corridors and chambers, the walls humming with the energy of the Zorfium extraction process. Thomas consulted the schematics Grix had provided, nodding to himself. "The vault should be just ahead. Jack, you take point. Lyra, watch our backs." They moved deeper into the facility, the air growing thick with the stench of chemicals and burnt metal. Suddenly, alarms began to blare, the lights flashing an angry red. "Damn it, they've made us," Jack growled, his blaster at the ready. Thomas just shook his head, a grim smile on his face. "No, that's Grix's virus. He's giving us the distraction we need. Move." They raced through the corridors, the sound of Zog soldiers echoing behind them. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of guards, their weapons raised. Thomas didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his blaster spitting fire as he dove for cover. Jack and Lyra were right behind him, their own weapons adding to the chaos. The firefight was brief but brutal, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. When the smoke cleared, the guards lay dead, and the vault door stood before them. Lyra stepped forward, her tools already in hand. "I'll have this open in a jiffy. Just keep those Zog bastards off my back." As Lyra worked, Thomas and Jack took up defensive positions, their eyes scanning the corridors for any sign of trouble. The minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the vault door swung open, revealing a chamber filled with glowing canisters of Zorfium. Thomas let out a low whistle, his eyes wide. "Jackpot. Grab as much as you can carry and let's get the hell out of here." They loaded up the Zorfium, their hearts pounding as they made their way back to the Relic. The ship was where they left it, Grix pacing nervously in the cargo hold. "You have it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Thomas just grinned, patting one of the canisters. "We got it, and a whole lot more besides. The rebels are going to love this." As they blasted off from the facility, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done the impossible, struck a blow against the Zog, and brought hope to the rebels. But he knew the fight was far from over. The Doomsday device was still out there, and the Zog would stop at nothing to see it completed. Thomas glanced at his crew, battered but unbroken. They had come this far together, and he knew they would see this through to the end. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope for victory, for a future free from the tyranny of the Zog. And with that hope burning in his heart, he set course for the rebel base, ready to take the fight to the enemy once more. As Thomas, Jack, and Lyra made their way deeper into the Zog mining facility, a sense of unease crept over them. The corridors were too quiet, the air too still. Thomas held up a hand, signaling for the others to stop. He peered around a corner, his eyes widening at the sight before him. There, in a large chamber filled with glowing tanks and humming machinery, were dozens of Saurian prisoners. They were suspended in a sickly green liquid, their bodies connected to a web of tubes and wires. Some thrashed weakly against their bonds, while others hung limply, their eyes vacant. "What the hell is this?" Jack whispered, his face pale. Thomas shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Experiments. They're testing the Zorfium on living subjects." Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's monstrous. We have to help them." As they moved closer, Thomas spotted a familiar face among the prisoners. It was Tharos the Saurian who had mocked him and the Relic back on the rebel base. He looked different now, his scales dull and his eyes haunted. Thomas hesitated for a moment, the memory of Tharos's taunt still fresh in his mind, but he couldn't leave him like this, no matter their past differences. He moved to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys. "Jack, Lyra, start disconnecting the prisoners. I'll work on shutting this thing down." As they set to work, the alarms began to blare, the room flashing with red light. Zog soldiers poured into the chamber, their weapons raised. "Take cover," Thomas shouted, diving behind a console as blaster fire filled the air. Jack and Lyra took up defensive positions, their own weapons spitting energy bolts at the advancing Zog. Thomas joined the fray, his aim true as he picked off soldier after soldier. But there were too many of them, and they were closing in fast. Thomas knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Suddenly Tharos was at his side, his eyes clear and determined. "Captain, I know a way out of here. A secret passage used by the Zog to transport the Zorfium." Thomas hesitated, unsure if he could trust the Saurian. But he saw the sincerity in Tharos's eyes, the desperation to make things right. "Lead the way," Thomas said, nodding. Tharos guided them through a hidden door, the sounds of battle fading behind them as they raced down a narrow tunnel. They emerged in a hangar bay, the Relic waiting for them like a beacon of hope. They boarded the ship, the rescued prisoners huddling in the cargo hold as Thomas and his crew took their stations. The hangar doors began to close, Zog ships appearing on the sensors. "Hang on!" Thomas shouted, punching the throttle. The Relic shot forward, barely clearing the doors as they slammed shut behind them. Zog fighters swarmed around them, their lasers scorching the Relic's shields. But Thomas was in his element now, his hands dancing over the controls as he wove the ship through the enemy fire. Jack and Lyra manned the guns, their shots precise and deadly. And then they were clear, the Zog ships falling behind as the Relic blasted into the star-studded void of space. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, a grin spreading across his face. They had done it. The Zorfium was theirs and the prisoners were safe, and they had a new ally in Tharos, a reminder that even the most unlikely of friendships could be forged in the heat of battle. But the war was far from over. The Doomsday device was still out there, and the Zog would be more determined than ever to see it completed. Thomas knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. But for now they could revel in their victory, and in the knowledge that they had struck a blow against the Zog's tyranny. And with his crew by his side, Thomas knew that anything was possible. As the Relic touched down at the rebel base, Thomas and his crew were greeted by a throng of cheering Saurians. They pumped their fists in the air, chanting the names of their heroes. Thomas grinned as he stepped off the ship, the Zorfium canisters securely in hand. Jack and Lyra followed close behind, their faces flushed with the thrill of victory. Tharos emerged last, blinking in the bright sunlight. The Saurians fell silent as they saw him, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. But Thomas stepped forward, clapping a hand on Tharos's shoulder. "This is Tharos," he said, his voice ringing out across the crowd. "He risked his life to help us escape the Zog facility. He's a hero just like the rest of us." The Saurians erupted in cheers once more, surging forward to embrace their newfound ally. Tharos looked overwhelmed, his eyes glistening with emotion. But the celebration was cut short by a blaring alarm. The base's sensors had detected a massive Zog fleet entering the system, headed straight for their location. "They must have tracked the Zorphium," Lyra said, her face grim. The rebel leaders quickly convened a meeting, their expressions tense with fear and determination. They knew they couldn't hope to defeat the Zog in a head-on battle. Their only chance was to evacuate the base and scatter their forces across the galaxy. "We need a diversion," the rebel commander said, his eyes scanning the room. "Something to draw the Zog away from the evacuation." Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set with resolve. "The Relic can do it. We'll take the Zorphium and lead the Zog on a wild goose chase. Give you time to get everyone to safety." The commander hesitated, but he knew there was no other choice. He nodded, clasping Thomas's hand in a firm grip. "You're a brave man, Thomas. May the stars guide you." As the base erupted into a flurry of activity, Thomas and his crew prepared the Relic for departure. Tharos approached, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm coming with you," he said, his voice brooking no argument. Thomas grinned, clasping Tharos's arm in a warrior's grip. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The Relic blasted off from the base, the stolen Zorphium secure in its hold. They had barely cleared the atmosphere when the sensors lit up with incoming contacts. The Zog had arrived. Thomas felt a thrill of recognition as he saw the lead ship. It was the same dreadnought they had faced before, its hull still scarred from their last encounter. "Looks like they want a rematch," Jack growled, his hands flying over the weapons console. Thomas just smiled, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Then let's give them one they won't forget." The Relic surged forward, its engines roaring as Thomas pushed them to their limits. The Zog ships gave chase, their lasers lancing through the void. Thomas wove the Relic through a field of asteroids, using the rocky debris as cover. The Zog dreadnought plowed through the field, its shields flaring as it absorbed the impacts. "They're not falling for the same trick twice," Lyra said, her eyes locked on the sensors. Thomas just nodded, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't outrun the Zog forever. They needed a new plan. Suddenly the console beeped with an incoming transmission. Thomas frowned, glancing at the others. "Hey, it's the Zog," Tharos said, his eyes widening in surprise. "They're hailing us." Thomas hesitated, then hit the accept button. The view screen flickered to life, revealing the sneering face of a Zog commander. "Surrender the Zorphium and your lives may be spared," the commander said, his voice dripping with contempt. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes hard as steel. "I have a counteroffer. Turn your fleet around and crawl back to whatever hole you slithered out of, and we won't blow you out of the sky." The commander laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You are in no position to make demands, human. You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, or face the consequences." Thomas just smiled, a feral light in his eyes. "I choose the consequences." He cut the transmission, then turned to his crew. "Strap in, folks, things are about to get bumpy." The Relic dove into a nearby nebula, its sensors struggling to penetrate the swirling gases. The Zog ships followed, their weapons firing blindly into the cloud. Thomas gritted his teeth as the ship shuddered under the impacts. He knew the Relic couldn't take much more of this punishment. But then a flicker of movement caught his eye. A small, unassuming ship, darting through the nebula like a fish through water. Thomas grinned, a plan forming in his mind. "Jack, patch me through to that ship. I think we just found our ace in the hole." The Relic surged forward, the Zog ships hot on its heels, but this time Thomas had a plan. A dangerous, reckless plan, but a plan nonetheless. And as the Relic plunged deeper into the nebula, Thomas felt a flicker of hope in his heart. They may be outnumbered and outgunned, but they were far from beaten. The Zog wanted a fight. Well, they were about to get one they'd never forget. The Relic shuddered as another volley of laser fire slammed into its shields. Thomas gritted his teeth, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to evade the pursuing Zog ships. The stolen Zorfium glowed in the cargo hold, a constant reminder of the high stakes they were playing for. "We can't keep running forever," Jack growled. His eyes locked on the sensor readouts. "Sooner or later they're going to catch us." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. They had the Zorfium, but what good was it if they couldn't use it to strike a blow against the Zog? Suddenly, an idea struck him. "Dr. Zoran," he called over the intercom, "is there any way we could use the Zorfium to destroy the Doomsday device?" There was a moment of silence. Then Zoran's voice crackled over the speakers. "Theoretically, yes. If we could create a makeshift bomb and detonate it near the device, the resulting explosion should be powerful enough to destroy it." Thomas felt a flicker of hope in his chest. "But we'd need to get close to the device first, and it's being assembled on the Zog's main command ship." "The ship that's sure to be heavily guarded," Lyra chimed in, her brow furrowed in thought. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a plan forming in his mind. "We use the Relic's unique signature to mask our approach, make them think we're just another Zog ship. Then we board the command ship and plant the bomb." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Just like that, huh? You make it sound so easy." Thomas grinned. "Never said it would be easy, but it's our best shot." They set to work, Dr. Zoran and Lyra crafting the Zorfium bomb, while Thomas and Jack plotted their approach. Tharos, his skills honed by years of infiltration and sabotage, helped them map out the command ship's defenses. As they neared the Zog fleet, Thomas felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. This was it, the moment of truth. He activated the Relic's signature masking device, holding his breath as they drifted closer to the command ship. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like the Zog would see through their ruse. But then they were past the outer defenses, gliding into the command ship's hangar bay like they belonged there. Thomas let out a sigh of relief, then turned to his crew. "All right, we split up. Jack, you're with me. We'll plant the bomb. Lyra, Tharos, you two sabotage the ship's defenses. Give us as much time as you can." They nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. As Thomas and Jack made their way through the ship's corridors, they encountered numerous close calls. Zog soldiers patrolled the halls, their weapons at the ready. But Thomas and Jack were quick and quiet, slipping past them like ghosts. Finally, they reached the chamber where the Doomsday device was being assembled. It was a massive, pulsing thing, its surface bristling with weapons and sensors. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at the sight of it. Working quickly, they planted the Zorfium bomb, setting the timer for 10 minutes. That should give them just enough time to escape. As they turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Thomas felt his blood run cold as he recognized the Zog's supreme commander, but there was something familiar about the way he moved, the way he held himself. The commander reached up and removed his helmet, revealing the smirking face of Grix. "You," Thomas growled, his hand going to his blaster. Grix laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Did you really think I was on your side? The Zog pay better." Thomas and Jack fought bravely, their blasters spitting fire as they dodged and weaved. But Grix had the advantage of numbers, Zog soldiers pouring into the room from all sides. Thomas felt a blaster bolt sear across his arm, the pain making him grit his teeth. Beside him, Jack cried out as a shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. Thomas stood over his fallen friend, his blaster raised in defiance. But he knew it was hopeless. They were outnumbered and outgunned with no chance of escape. As the Zog closed in, Thomas could only hope that Lyra and Tharos had succeeded in their mission, that the Relic and its precious cargo were safe. For the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and time was running out. Thomas fired his blaster at the advancing Zog soldiers, the searing bolts of energy cutting through their armor like it was made of paper. Jack and Lyra were right beside him, their weapons spitting death as they tried to clear a path to the hangar bay where the Relic was waiting. But there were too many of them. For every Zog that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. They were being pushed back inch by inch, their escape route slowly being cut off. Tharos suddenly stepped forward, his eyes hard with determination. "Go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll hold them off." Thomas shook his head. "We're not leaving you behind." Tharos grabbed him by the shoulders, his grip firm. "You have to. The galaxy needs you, Thomas. The rebellion needs you. I'm just a soldier, expendable. But you're the one who can make a difference." Thomas wanted to argue, to tell Tharos that he was wrong, that every life mattered. But deep down he knew the Saurian was right. The mission was more important than any one of them. He clasped Tharos's arm, meeting his gaze. "I won't forget this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget you." Tharos just nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Give them hell, Captain." With that he turned and charged at the Zog, his blaster firing as he let out a bellowing war cry. Thomas, Jack and Lyra took advantage of the distraction, racing towards the hangar bay as the sounds of battle faded behind them. They had just reached the Relic when the explosion hit. The deck bucked beneath their feet, sending them stumbling. Thomas caught himself on the edge of the airlock, his heart pounding in his chest. "The bomb," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. "It worked." Thomas nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Let's hope it was enough." They scrambled aboard the Relic, sealing the airlock behind them. Thomas threw himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls as he brought the engines online. The hangar bay doors were already starting to close, the Zog trying to trap them inside. But Thomas wasn't about to let that happen. He punched the throttle, the Relic surging forward like a wild beast unleashed. They barely made it through the narrowing gap, the edges of the doors scraping against the Relic's hull with a shriek of tortured metal. And then they were out, the stars stretching before them like an endless sea. But their escape was short-lived. The shockwave from the explosion slammed into the Relic like a hammer blow, sending them tumbling end over end. Alarms blared throughout the ship, warning lights flashing red. "We've lost main power," Jack shouted over the din. "Engines are offline, life support is failing." Thomas gritted his teeth, fighting to bring the ship back under control. But it was no use. The Relic was dead in space, drifting aimlessly among the stars. He slumped back in his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had done it. The Doomsday device was destroyed, the Zog's command ship nothing more than a cloud of debris. But at what cost? Tharos was gone, sacrificing himself so that they could escape. And now the Relic was crippled, its crew facing an uncertain fate. Thomas reached out with a shaking hand, activating the distress beacon. It was a long shot, he knew. The rebels were scattered, their forces stretched thin. But it was their only hope. As the beacon pulsed out its desperate call for help, Thomas let his mind drift back over the events of the past few days. The battles, the sacrifices, the moments of triumph and despair. He thought of Tharos, of the courage and loyalty the Saurian had shown in the face of overwhelming odds. He thought of Grix, of the betrayal that had nearly cost them everything. But most of all he thought of his crew, of Jack and Lyra who had stood by his side through it all. They were more than just a crew, he realized. They were a family. And that, he knew, was the true strength of the Relic. Not its weapons or its technology, but the bonds that held them together. The courage and determination that had carried them through the darkest of times. As the Relic drifted through the endless void, Thomas knew that their story was far from over. They had struck a blow against the Zog, but the war was far from won. But whatever the future held, he knew that they would face it together, for they were the crew of the Relic and their legacy would live on long after they were gone. A legacy of hope, of resistance, of the indomitable spirit of those who fought for freedom against all odds, and that Thomas knew was a legacy worth fighting for. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.